of 8 p.m. to 10 p.m. playing R&B, soul and neo music each and every Saturday.
What's up, London? This is the Ladies' Choice. Mix Master Caesar coming to you straight from the 6 with the Red Platinum Mix Show every Saturday, 10 p.m. until midnight. Spinning the best music in hip-hop, R&B, soca, reggae, and top 40 exclusively on iLife Radio. Changing the way you listen to radio.
Hi, this is Miss Law. Tune in to Talks Honest every Sunday, 4 p.m. to 5 p.m. on iLive UK, discussing topics often thought of but never spoken. That's Sundays, 4 p.m. to 5 p.m. right here on iLive UK.
The Spice of Life with the Baroness, each and every Sunday from 5 to 7 on iLive UK.
Hip.hop.soul.
It's your boy Merch Millions.
Boy Wonder.
And Amina.
Every Friday, 9 p.m. till midnight.
We play soulful hip-hop, neo-soul, alternative hip-hop and R&B.
With exclusive edits and remixes.
Check us out at vibeldn.com. Hip-hop soul radio on iLive UK. Changing the way you listen to radio.
Hip-hop soul.
Hip-hop soul.
Hip-hop soul.
Music back to back on iLive Radio.
Good evening, one and all. Ray Hendricks at the control.
When they took my friend away.
Welcome into darkness on iLive Radio. Each and every Wednesday,
While laughing at the moon, slipping into darkness,
spinning new music without borders.
take my mind beyond the trees. I was slipping into darkness, yeah. Take my mind beyond the trees. Where I talk to my brother.
Some say today has been the hottest day of the year.
Who never said their name.
But wherever you are in the world, we're living at a strange time. Things are so quiet, and yet people, as of Monday, are meant to have resumed their normal lifestyle. But tonight I'm going to take you on a special journey with my very special guest, Mr. Michael Riley.
I got a wife and a baby, yeah, yeah. Oh, 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 oh. Now my love has gained its fame, yeah. Slipping into darkness, yeah. When I heard my mother say.
And as we head into the last week of the month, last week of June, and I'm told that officially we are beyond the Gemini cycle. So anyone who's celebrating a birthday from today onwards, I think it was probably from Monday onwards, you are not a Gemini. What you are, that's up to you.
You've been slipping into darkness.
Special birthday greeting to Miss Jeannie Gray, whose birthday is in fact tomorrow. Happy birthday, Jean. And I'd just like to commend last week's guest, Mr. Tony Remy, for a wonderfully entertaining session. And you may remember that, Tony, that you tried to play your first, a track of your first album, your very first album on GRP. We didn't get to the end of it. So tonight I'm going to start by playing the whole of Boof. Welcome to Slipping Into Darkness on iLive Radio. And here we have Mr. Tony Remy and Boof. Tony Remy with Boof from his very first album released in 1994. I'm going to change the tack a little because tonight with Michael Riley we'll be bringing the discussion to touch on bass culture and what he does as director of the Black Music Research Unit at the University of Westminster. And I'm going to play a track now which has some of the finest jazz musicians that we have produced here from the Caribbean. And it's in a track which is by Aswad, Warrior Charge. Listen to this. Use up about it. time passes. That track was recorded 40 years ago in 1980. Aswad and Warrior Charge. Before I move on to my next track, which is introducing a wonderful young player, there is, shall we say, lots of green shoots that are starting to blossom in the jazz field in this country. And one of those is a young man by the name of Sultan Stevenson. Now, before I play this track, I omitted to mention last week that it was the 3rd anniversary of Grenfell. Last night, I happened to listen to a BBC. I think it was the 2nd time that this thing has been broadcast. But it was a broadcast of one of the survivors, one of the last people to leave the building, to leave the Grenfell Tower. His name was Antonio Roncolato. If you have a chance to listen to his account of his son waking him up in the burning building and him having to negotiate his way out of the building, it is really a harrowing tale. So, Antonio, this is for you, your family, and this is also for the victims and the survivors of Grenfell who are still seeking justice. Mr. Sultan Stevenson, a young talent who is going to grow and grow. Thank you for that. Shades of the Jazz Messengers, Art Blakey's wonderful Jazz Messengers, and you will go from strength to strength. Now, I'm going to bring in my very special guest because I think that you want to hear what he's got to say. I want to hear what he's got to say. And it's my welcome to Mr. Michael Riley to the iLive studio. How you doing, Michael?
So far, so good.
Good to hear, good to hear. Well, we're looking forward, because I sort of advertised this before, as looking at this issue of bass culture and looking at your field of study, your field of research, which is the influence that black music has had on this society. Now, I don't know how far back you're going, but I'm aware that there was black music in this society from the early 1900s, when there were bands from America who were touring and playing here. The name that we know best is Sidney Bechet. But there were others. There were musical troupes who were coming to this country to perform. So I'm very intrigued by what you've got to tell us about your research, and I'm even more intrigued by some of the music that you're going to be putting across. So if you can introduce us to the first track that you've selected, please.
The first track, let me just contextualize this. Some of our first influences come from the home. So the first track is representative of my dad's musical taste.
Okay.
He used to call it tinkling. And that is jazz played on the piano.
Right.
So the first track is by Oscar Peterson, Boogie Blues Etude. It's a live performance. And it's one of those performances where at some point you question how many people are actually involved. It's just one person on the piano, but somehow he's grown multiple fingers.
Wow! So you had a piano in your front room?
I wish. It was called the Blues Spot Graham, and no one was allowed to play it.
Yeah. The sacred instrument in the front room.
But this was the kind of music that on a Sunday or a weekend you'd hear,
listening to,
and he'd say, "Listen to this."
Good stuff. Okay, let's hear this, Mr. Oscar Peterson. Oscar Peterson in concert, and I think he took us probably through 5 phases of what would be called jazz in just that one tune.
That was the whole idea. I mean, he's giving you a narrative that takes us from blues all the way through to rock and roll.
Right, okay. Now, we were talking, and you said that you were aware of it. Oscar Peterson was the first musician I used to see. He had a BBC half-hour show where he, bass player and drummer, and we're trying to remember the name of the drummer. So if anyone listening out there can actually recall the name of the drummer. The bass player was a Danish player, Niels Henning Pedersen. But we can't pick up the name of the drummer. So if you know the drummer, please either email to ilivek@iliveradio.com or just give me a call and tell me who this drummer is, because it's eating away at my brain. And you saw that. The next thing that we're going to go to, if you can say something, because Joe Harriott is one of the fixtures in effectively British jazz.
Absolutely, and he's one of the individual musicians that introduced what I'm calling Jamaican jazz to the UK, or actually, the truth about it was Jamaican jazz players,
right?
To the UK, and this is a really important musician alongside other individuals like Coleridge Good, who was the double bass player. Mm-hmm. And these individuals, I should also point out, they're born in the mid-1920s. But they arrived in the UK after the Second World War. Right. And they introduced the music. They were the physical representation of jazz in the UK. They didn't have black Americans. It was actually Jamaicans and Caribbeans. And so what is important about these musicians is they established jazz in the UK during a period where American GIs or American musicians were banned at one point from performing in the UK. So again, another important musician, another important track.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but their banning was a trade union issue because they were not members of the Musicians Union.
It was a technicality that meant where there's scarcity of work, they could ban these musicians, and that jazz interest mushroomed at that point, and that work then went to white jazz musicians. So it's an interesting period of history how the union worked to support certain musicians by restricting the opportunity to work for others.
And these are musicians whose praises they sang, saying we hail them when they came. Not to play, just to come and visit.
This is the very music that they were in love with. So it's an interesting part of British music history that a lot of people are not sure aware of. But it's also a period where you had individuals like Ray Ellington. That he found most of his work, I think, it was Spike Milligan's band, which is also on the BBC. So Spike Milligan has to be commended for introducing black musicians and jazz to the BBC.
Wow. Okay, let's go for it. This is Joe Harriott. Mr. Joe Harriet there. We mentioned some names. Ernest Ranglin. You're talking about the Alpha Boys School.
In Jamaica.
Yes, please say something.
Which is a really important educational establishment which looked after young individuals that, let's say, lost their way in Jamaica and took them in and gave them a trade. And one of the conditions was that you took everything really seriously. You practiced. You aspired to be your best. And what they produced is a whole collection of musicians, Jamaican musicians, which actually underpin Jamaican popular music, all the way from jazz through to blues beat, through to ska, through to rocksteady. You'll find all the way into reggae. These musicians, if you talk about ska and you say, I don't know, the Scatterlights, you'll find these musicians were jazz musicians who'd moved into the next genre, popular genre, which was ska. And that gave them a certain skill set, standard of performance, and relationship with their audience, which demanded the highest possible performance. So when they arrived in the UK, these were seasoned musicians that were able to adapt to whatever work was available. So many of the jazz musicians, if they couldn't find work as jazz musicians, would play in bands like Georgie Fame and Blue Flames. Ronnie Scott's became a really important venue for individuals that we'll come to in a minute on another track, like Ernest Ranglin, again a jazz musician who has established very much the ska phenomenon in the UK with his hit My Boy Lollipop. But we'll come back to that.
Okay, all right. Well, tell me what the next track will be so I can line it up. And I want you to say something, because obviously we were hearing these musicians because every single rocksteady would have a horn section. So we were actually hearing these musicians without recognizing them, because, of course, unless they made the record, they were rarely ever named on the record. Well, tell me what the next track is you want to play, and if you could say something about that, please.
The next track is Guns of Navarro.
Okay, all right.
By the Scatterlights. And in this track, you will hear the horns, you will hear the brass section. And the brass section very much is echoing, is reflecting, is reimagining the jazz horn sections from America. Jamaica was great at reinterpreting and then putting its own stamp on things. And in the Scatterlights, you hear great versions of American R&B, but also they would rip off a film. So the Guns of Navarro, I think, is taken from one of those old
Western films. Yeah. Well, Art Blakey once said in my hearing, he said, "Good musicians borrow, great musicians steal." So I think we have some great musicians in play.
We have a combination.
Okay, let's hear Guns of Navarro. And all of you who used to go to those early blues dances will know this one, Guns of Navarro.
Winter of 1964 came this movie to Jamaica. The Scatterlights took the music from the movie, put it to the ska, and came up with this sound. It's called Navarone.
You're listening to Slipping Into Darkness on iLive Radio with my very special guest, Mr. Michael Riley. And listening to that, the vitality of the music, and those musicians coming into what in effect was a dull English setting. You know, because I'm intrigued by this thing, bass culture, and bringing bass culture into English society, which probably was most resistant at the time. But their musicians picked it up.
I think one of the interesting things about music is it's a language you don't have to learn.
Mm-hmm.
It's suddenly familiar,
yeah,
infectious,
mm-hmm,
and addictive.
Yeah, yeah.
And so once I think people, if they were privileged enough, fortunate enough to witness a performance, because the performances came later.
Yeah, yeah.
Initially, it was just the records, the music, the sound system.
Mm-hmm.
But we sometimes forget, we start with the sound system, we forget, actually, just before that, there was the jazzers that were here and performing across the West End in places like Piccadilly. I can't remember the name of that club in Piccadilly, the famous club where you had people like, Shaking Hips, what's his name, Stevens, Shaking, I'm not sure, I don't want to say this, the wrong guy.
This is the Caribbean.
This is Caribbeans in Piccadilly in the jazz
Snake
club.
Hips.
Snake Hips. That's
Yes.
it. Snake Hips.
Snake Hips. Yeah.
Johnson.
Yes.
That's it.
Yeah, yeah.
So there was a whole scene here before the sound system
Right.
arrived,
And
which was
that's
the
kind
jazzers.
of pre-war, going through the Second World War.
It's
wasn't it?
Yeah, it's going coming into the Second World War and coming out of it.
Yeah, yeah.
And that scene created a community that up until that point, it was kind of ballroom dancing.
Right, yes.
And so if you wanted to be a bit risque, you'd go into the West End and you would see black Caribbean jazz musicians performing.
So this is the socialites kind of extending their range.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
So this was a really important scene. These musicians were important to breaking the ice, to creating a new relationship. Unfortunately, a bomb landed on the club.
That is unfortunate. I think the Snake Hips was Guyanese.
Ooh.
In fact, I think so, because the tale I heard is that a lot of the Guyanese musicians who came here were actually trained in the police band. They actually got their skill from being in this police. And you mentioned something before about, in terms of the musicians who came out of Jamaica, the seriousness of their intent and the discipline that they actually had instilled in them in music.
I mean, they're coming from a background where in order to escape or leave the island, you needed a proper skill. Yeah. And they're listening to American jazz musicians. Yes, it's not like today where everyone has basically a television on their phone. It was rare that you saw these musicians, but you heard these musicians, and these musicians were carried a very, very high status. And so they dressed like the American musicians. They aspired to carry themselves like the American musicians, and they aspired actually to be in America. We were fortunate for people when people like Joe Harriott decided to come to the UK. But America would have been the first destination. But the Brits were also very accommodating for these musicians. I mean, we're talking about a different period. But for the jazz musicians, they had they took over the status, if you like, that the American GIs after the Second World War established. So this is it's an interesting period where jazz was actually challenging classical musicianship. Wow! So the very first track I played with Oscar Peterson, he dabbles in there's classical references in there as well, classical music references. There's jazz, there's blues, there's rock and roll. And then he speeds everything up and mixes it all up. And even the musicians in the band, if you see this BBC recording of it, they're amazed at his hands. And he's holding down a tune whilst playing the lead, whilst soloing at the same time. So there's a standard of musicianship there that is aspirational at best. But it's crushing at worst.
When you're looking at it. Well, the thing is that Oscar Peterson, classically trained, Canadian, classically trained, went into jazz appreciate. I mean, Sonny Rollins, and these effectively are non-Americans who are coming into the tradition and yet being revered by all the people that they meet. And we're talking about the 40s, the 50s, which was the key period for the development of jazz in the US.
Oh, absolutely. And, you know, in terms of, you know, the Bass Culture Project is really saying, look, the Caribbean, and I deliberately separate the impact of African Americans here. I'm saying the Caribbeans have impacted on British culture. The sound of British culture, the look of it, how we speak, even how we walk down the road, how we wear. Jamaicans brought the cool, and the musicians were right up front in doing that. I mean, we were challenged and often suffocated by the juggernaut of talent that was coming out of America. If it wasn't Oscar, it might have been Thelonious Monk or Dizzy or Count Basie or Duke Ellington. You know, the list is Miles Davis. You know, but we had a hit with a jazz / classical pianist called Winifred Atwell. Right, and this is the kind of stuff that would be played in my house. And I'm not saying I liked it at the time. The truth be known. I was listening to it. I'm hearing it, and I'm absorbing it, and I'm into my reggae team, right? But that was in the background, and the whole time I'm thinking, if we played to that standard.
You're listening to iLive Radio, changing the way you listen to radio. iLive Radio. You're listening to iLive Radio.
This is Lisa Banton, and you're listening to iLive Radio, changing the way you listen to radio.
Hey, this is music producer Reggie Marks, and you're listening to iLive Radio, changing the way that you listen to radio.
This is Miracle Thomas, and you're listening to iLive Radio, changing the way you listen to radio.
Hey, what's up? This is DJ Jarzino right here on iLive UK, the station that's changing the way you listen to radio. Catch me each and every Thursday from 9 p.m. till midnight, where I'll be giving you 3 hours of orgasmic sounds, live interviews, and a special ladies seduction selection. So do me a favor, come on, spread the word and share the link. It's the Love Freeness Radio Show every Thursday on iLive UK.
Through like Funky Friday.
Yes, peoples, it's your boy Dazzle UK right here, right now, letting you know about Fridays, 4 till 7. We're going to get you ready for the weekend, playing the freshest beats, live interviews, loads of banter on iLive UK.
Hip.hop.soul.
It's your boy Merch Millions.
Boy Wonder.
And Amina.
Every Friday, 9 p.m. till midnight.
We play soulful hip-hop, neo-soul, alternative hip-hop and R&B.
With exclusive edits and remixes.
Check us out at vibeldn.com. Hip-hop soul radio on iLive UK. Changing the way you listen to radio.
Hip-hop soul.
Hip-hop soul.
Hip-hop soul.
Hey. Hello and welcome. It's your girl Claude, aka Miss Out, right here on iLive UK. Be sure to tune into my shows each and every Saturday between the hours of 6 and 8 p.m. My shows are called The Independent Injection because you can expect to hear deep and meaningful, fresh neo and bassline soul, slow jams and gospel mixed with a little bit of nostalgia. I look forward to seeing you then. Bye.
Join the Music Collective family every Sunday for the Sunday Vibe from 12 till 4 on iLive Radio. For the best in quality music, special theme shows quarterly, and the infamous End of the Month show, when the Music Collective family get together for fun and frolics. So don't miss out on your Sunday Vibe on iLive Radio via the TuneIn app or the iLive mobile app. See you Sunday. Music Collective Sunday Vibe on iLive Radio.
It's
Spice of Life with the Baroness each and every Sunday from 5 to 7 on iLive UK.
Yo, you're listening to Paolo Large. This is Drops of Tabasco Radio. Make sure you lock in every Sunday 9 to 11. That's for that chill hop trap soul. We've got future beats, we've got Afro Fuse, all of that good stuff. Make sure you come check us out. Every Sunday 9 to 11, there's no other place to be. Let's go.
Join me, Sims Mode, for that Saturday vibe every Saturday between 4 and 6 p.m. on iLive UK, giving you 2 hours of music, talk and discussions, competitions, interviews with guests, local, national and international from all walks of life. So keep it iLive UK for that Saturday vibe.
You're listening to iLive Radio, changing the way you listen to radio. iLive Radio.
You're listening to Slipping Into Darkness on iLive Radio, and we were having such a buzzing conversation, myself and Michael, that we actually forgot to just halt before the break. We didn't even give ourselves the 30 seconds to sort of just run into the break. So welcome back to Slipping Into Darkness on iLive Radio with my very special guest, Michael Riley, and he's taking us into the roots of Caribbean music and Caribbean musicians in the UK, and also what was being established in the Caribbean itself. So, Michael, the next track that you've lined up, please introduce it, because it is another wonderful track by another wonderful, phenomenal musician.
Okay, next up is Ernest Ranglin. And most people will arrive at Ernest via his production and his work on My Boy Lollipop with Minnie Small, which is the big hit from 1964 that really cemented the relationship between Jamaican popular music and the UK. But prior to this, Ernest is a jazz musician, accomplished jazz guitarist. In fact, after his audition in the early 60s at Ronnie Scott's, he got a booking for 6 months.
Wow.
And that's unprecedented. So he was at Ronnie Scott's every day, week in, week out, performing for 6 months. And that also established a relationship between Jamaican jazz musicians and the UK. And the British, people like Rico are part of that tradition.
Of course,
bands I was talking about earlier, like Georgie Fame, would employ either West African musicians or Jamaican jazzers, because they were the available jazzers in the UK. You couldn't find, it was hard to find, let's put it that way, American jazzers. There was enough work in America. So these musicians were really important. And Ernest is also, I think, uncle of Gary Cosby.
Of course.
So there's a tradition here in terms of, if you like, we got a relationship between Alpha Boys School that championed musicianship and Jamaicans born in Jamaica that are jazzers, and then UK musicians born in the UK.
The next generation.
The next generation, which is even a family connection, that carry on that tradition. So again, in terms of what we're looking at, is none of this is written up as a continuous history in the UK. It's not in the curriculum. And I think what we're trying to stress here is that this music has been here for the lifetime. It precedes the Windrush. Right? And it's still not recognized. Why is it not part of British history, British music education? So next up is Ernest, and it's a track you probably have not heard it from Ernest.
Okay, let's go for it. Ernest Ranglin. You're listening to Slipping Into Darkness on iLive Radio, and we're getting a wonderful, wonderful tutorial, I'll call this, because Michael's background now is in an academic institution. And I'd please say something about this historical gold that we have, which is being unrecognized. Is the current examination of the British narrative. Is it a chance for us to perhaps just force the issue on this score, on the musical front?
Well, one of the things we're looking at is the absence of the black or Caribbean contribution to British history.
Right.
And that absence is not just in terms of the workplace. It's in terms of the books, it's in terms of the films, it's in terms of all manner of outputs and mediums. Mm-hmm. And one of the most important ones, I would argue, having worked in an academic institution, is the curriculum.
Yeah.
It's what is taught in schools. And these contributions that predate the Windrush, it's not part of the curriculum. Exactly. Sorry. And one of the questions being asked right now is, how does British history reflect the Caribbean presence?
Yeah.
And because my area is music, that is exactly what I'm looking at.
Right.
And there's a rich contribution here, a continuous contribution.
Mm-hmm.
The last track was Ernest Wrangling, but if we look at that period, which is 1964, it's a track which was embraced by mods, the first wave of skinheads. It's part of British subculture and counterculture. So by the time we get to the 70s, we have kids that are grown up with Jamaican popular music in their house.
Right.
By the time we're leaving the 70s and we hit two-tone, these kids, these British kids, it's their music. As far as they're concerned, it's now two generations. They're growing up with it and they interpret it in their own way. So the absence of a Caribbean presence in this narrative means that very quickly you have individuals who have no connection. They don't understand the connection to the Caribbean or with this music and so forth, or the origins. So this is the work that we're doing, and every track that we're playing here has a contribution to it. So from Ernest, we can look at Gary Cosby, and that DNA in terms of music and musical contributions which continue, because he now runs one of the most important schools,
of course,
which is in its own way echoing the Alpha Boy tradition.
Tomorrow's Warriors.
Exactly. Exactly.
Well, Gary, I told you to listen tonight, right? Because I know you're an old man, but you
careful.
But your uncle is getting his proper props. I mean, one of the things is you're in an academic institution. We're looking at across the board. These things have to be valued, because what has happened, in the last 6 months is that England is being told, the United Kingdom is being told, it's not just a what do they call it? A one-shot pony?
It was one shot. It's not, but it's important to recognize that the reparations paid to slave owners was only paid off, I think, in 2015.
Yes.
Right. So when we say Great Britain, it's great on the back of Africans. Right. So it really depends. You can start this conversation wherever you want, really, in terms of why this is part of British history. This is not migrant history. This is British history. And so these contributions, these recent contributions, if you want to put it that way, are really important in that they should be part of what is in schools. You shouldn't be able to grow up in the UK and not understand where this fits into the jigsaw, the complicated jigsaw, which is British history, which is why you'll have individuals that feel we are still somehow migrants.
Yes.
My parents didn't travel here on some alien passport. They traveled here on a British passport by the bequest of Britain. That's, and it's difficult, I think, to explain that after the fact, 70 years down the line, when someone has grown up without that information or as a distorted version of that. But at least we're looking at the responses to the George Floyd situation. You look on the street and you see, actually, it's a multicultural, it's a rainbow, they're calling it, response in terms of youth asking the question, now, does this make sense? Are we not equal? Shouldn't the system change? And whilst I think there are many voices that will challenge even that support, I think it's important to understand from the opposite side, they've not had that information either.
Exactly.
Right. So I think music gives us an opportunity to have a whole different conversation in a different language, one that creeps up on you.
Well, I think it was, 2 or 3 days ago, the BBC announced that it was going to create a diversity fund. And so I think they must get about 3 billion, and they were only talking 100 million. So obviously we're still kind of picking up the crumbs. But I think it's a case you mentioned before, that this issue of people now being able to access information online and the increased use of individuals accessing information could force the issue even further, because the BBC is sitting on a pile of money and doing the usual things with it.
One of the interesting things about the BBC is it's really about trumpeting and championing a British narrative. And when we look at music, we can take that all the way back to the birth of pop and the battle between the Rolling Stones and the Beatles. And the BBC took the line of the Beatles. This is how we see our youth being represented. Good haircuts, suits, ties, that rebellious bunch over there with the long hair. And
well behaved, I think they call it in the day.
But one of the differences was that the Stones said, this is black music.
Yes.
And they told that to the Americans.
Yes.
Whereas the Beatles' response, reluctantly,
they're only coming out now,
was, we might have, to use your term, borrowed. Or referenced.
But that's true. And the funny thing is that this competitive element was even in the Caribbean, because the BBC controlled all music played on radio. So you were permitted to hear certain things in the Caribbean. And when people ask, well, why is it that my parents always had Jim Reeves? Because that's what you were permitted to hear. You would not have heard any of the Alpha Boys playing music in their own society.
Well, no, but when we look at Jamaica, I think we have more churches per capita than
exactly. So
anywhere in the world.
The music was going on.
Religious music was the most dominant music on radio up until, I think, 1987.
Right, okay.
So everything else took second place, third place, fourth place. And by the time you get to reggae, that is a special event on a weekend.
You have to buy a pass. Well, listen, you're listening to Slipping Into Darkness with my special guest, Mr. Michael Riley. We're hearing some tremendous researched information tonight around the music that we will call bass culture, because bass culture applies only to one, should we say, one concept of music in the world. And that's the music coming from the Caribbean, coming from particularly Jamaica. But it also has Trinidad roots, it also has Guyanese, all of the territories in the Caribbean, because people have moved across the region. So even though you may have a top Caisonian in Trinidad, Sparrow came from Grenada. So let's remember, all are we as one. Anyway, let's listen now to Courtney Pine. Courtney Pine, and you were saying that this was a BBC recording.
This is a BBC live recording of Courtney Pine. God, who else was in that band? I think he had Gary Cosby on bass.
Wow.
For this. And
will it be Vidal Montgomery on? Oh no, because if Gary's playing, it's not Vidal. No. If Gary's there, it's not Vidal. Robert Forjour drums. That ring a bell?
I'm not sure. I think it was the William Brothers.
Okay.
One of the William Brothers on drums.
Yeah.
And there might have been. I'm just trying to think. Because they didn't give a lineup.
Yeah.
But it was a lineup for the TV performance.
Okay. Oh, yeah.
But again, what we have here is that classic Caribbean / Jamaican combination. You've got jazz.
Yeah.
Both musicians have a Jamaican connection. Mm-hmm. Both musicians created at some point a reggae album. Courtney also had an association with Island Records, the classic kind of reggae label back in the day as well. And so we see there's continuity here as well. The Jamaican or Caribbean relationship to reggae was never compromised by jazz.
Right.
It was simply embraced. Same as Ernest would play straight jazz, would also reflect his roots.
Right,
This happened in the UK. UK musicians were looking for, what are my roots? Am I British? Am I Caribbean? Am I the music that I play? And most musicians found a path through the middle of all of that, which would include all of that, which resulted in a unique musical expression.
Right, okay.
So the black British musicians created a unique sound because of their, I suppose you'd call it their cumulative experience, which often challenged what was happening in Jamaica.
Right.
I mean, we were speaking earlier about lovers rock, another genre created by a non-Jamaican, Dennis Bovell.
Yes, Dennis. we found you. A great musician.
Fantastic musician. But this is the dominance of the Big Island, they would say.
Right,
so it meant that most West Indians, as people were described back in the day, particularly the guys, would adopt a Jamaican accent.
Yes, of course.
Because that was the dominant island in the UK in terms of feet on the ground. And also when it came to music.
Right.
But don't forget, there was master musicians from the other islands, Trinidad and so forth, Barbados, that championed calypso.
Yeah, of course.
So some of the music would have that edge in it as well. But it's fair to say that if we look at where we are with Courtney Pine, that's mid-80s now, we also have the first generation of black British-born Caribbeans making music.
Right.
This is where you find your Aswads, your Steel Pulses, and whatever, challenging the Jamaican sound, the Jamaican narrative in music.
And it was different.
It has to be different because music is reflective of your location and your accumulative experiences. You can't pretend, although we thought we could, to be Jamaican. And Jamaicans just come over and go, that was the expression.
Exactly. Not quite,
Not quite, no. And it in the same way that I think Jamaicans in Jamaica aspired to be the best possible jazz musicians, we in the UK aspired to be the best possible reggae musicians. And to gain the respect from a Jamaican audience was hard won, very hard won. I mean, in the early days, you went in and you took your life in your own hands when you went on stage and challenged the sound system.
Well, that one thing I want you were on tour with the Wailers.
Yeah.
Now, presuming as a support, do you go on stage saying, "I'm going to show them," or just let me just get through this because I know people are only waiting to see what's coming? I mean, because Steel Pulse. There's nowhere in the world that Steel Pulse passed through that they didn't get thrilled.
I think we were totally in awe of Bob Marley and the Wailers at that time. And to be fair, we're also in awe of even Aswad. We're from Birmingham.
Yeah.
So we're not on the musical map at that point. You travel to London to make an entry on that map.
Right, okay.
And at one point, it was us or Aswad that was going to get Bob Marley's first European tour.
Right, okay.
And we honestly believe we didn't stand a fighting chance.
Wow.
And it was not until we got the gig, and I think it was somewhere in Paris, either just before or just after the gig, we bumped into Bob Marley because he has his own entourage around him at the time. And we asked the question, so why us? And the response was, well, you sound different.
Wow.
Whereas Aswad actually mastered the Jamaican sound. We didn't. We sounded different. And in that, I think it meant that we're not challenging at all. We are something different.
You're creating new ground.
Yeah, we had our own sound.
Yeah.
And that gave us an edge.
Right.
You know, so it took a while, I think, for the Caribbean community to accept us. Because as far as they were concerned, we were some fake Jamaican, Jamaicans making fake reggae.
Not in my ears. Not in my ears.
That was, but you don't come from Handsworth. As someone reminded me the other day, Handsworth is Little Jamaica. That's how they refer to it in London.
I got there late, and it was in a carnival capacity, and I didn't behave too well, so so I'm told. I wasn't aware of it, but no, I hear what you're saying. And one of the things before we go to the next track, you were saying about, in a sense, young people and the young people who have passed through your hands in the institution, and I mean we're talking hundreds, not just a few. We're talking hundreds.
Well, now, thousands now. I've been there 20 years.
There you go. So this has to have an impact in the long term.
Sure. I mean, one of the first impacts, you say institution, I'll say university. It sounds like I work in a prison. So
okay. It's a building, yeah, with locks, yeah.
One of the first areas or moments of impact is that I'm a black male.
Right.
So the majority of my life in university, I'm the only black person in the room.
Right. Okay.
Now, from a student perspective, I can remember when I first started, students would come up to me and say, "You're a bit old for this course."
Yeah.
And I say, "Careful, I might fail you."
Yeah.
Staff would come up to me and ask me, "What am I doing in the staff canteen?"
Yeah.
So that has changed over the years.
Right.
But that challenge, there's a. I think we as black community, we take it on our shoulder, we take it in our stride. But there's a challenge when you move into these spaces and you're the lone representative of your community. Often you just want to voice your own opinion, and somehow it's taken that you're representing your whole community.
Of course.
Every word, everything that you do, which creates a certain pressure. So apart from doing your job, you're carrying this weight the whole time. In terms of students, it was also challenging because I introduced content into my lectures that does not appear in any other of the taught content. And that content that I'm introducing is me. It's us. It's saying, look, have you heard of this musician? You heard of that musician? Do you realize who produced that record? Do you know the reference of that record? Or do you know where that sample comes from? And it became a challenge. And the challenge was not just the individual or individual students in front of me. It's a challenge to the whole system.
The system, exactly.
Which ended up at one point even challenging the British Library and the National Sound Archive, saying the collection does not represent the contribution, and they were obliged to buy a copy of each record released at one point to preserve British musical culture. And I'm saying, well, how are we represented if we're not in the books and we're not in the libraries? How does that work? It's like every day we're being erased. And so from a lecturer point of view, the challenge became, how do we introduce this content without it being rejected? Because you can't just change the curriculum. And without getting really technical, when you introduce new content, you have to also prove need. Is there a need for this new content? And so if a student doesn't recognize they need this content, they're not going to champion it. And if you have, they're paying customers. If they don't like a module, they can turn around and say, why are we taking this module? So even the term bass culture came about because of the resistance to calling anything black. When it was called bass culture, students took the module to find out what it was. When it was called This is Black British Music, that was a title initially. People, I don't need to do that. I'm doing EDM, or I'm doing dance music, or whatever. And I said, you actually need to understand this.
The source.
So even the title became its own challenge. And this is after years of working at different titles and trying to introduce content. I realized I had to come up with a new title, and then researching, and actually Adrian Bovell, Dennis's son, was one of my students. And we had this whole conversation at one point about his history growing up with his dad, because he's a master musician, now a pastor. But and he toured with Linton and whatever. And then I started to think about it and went back into Linton's catalogue and to the poem, which was 73, 74, I think, the poem Bass Culture, and said, we're going to use that, because everyone at the time was using bass culture for drum and bass. So I took it back to Linton and says, Linton, would you endorse this? And he went, yeah, definitely, because this is British history. So everyone that then challenged me on the use of bass culture, because it was common, lots of people were using it, clubs. In fact, one of the biggest drum and bass websites that was in the 2000s, getting up to 1 million hits a week, was titled Bass Culture, and it was a club night. So they challenged me on the use of it. And I said, let's have a meeting. And actually the guy was really open-minded, and he says, you know what, from now on, we support you. And he came, he did lectures, everything. And so it's a slow march towards changing the national curriculum. But in essence, what we're doing is simply bringing people up to speed about stuff they're already familiar with. If you've been listening to music for the last half century in the UK, you're familiar with this contribution. You've just not joined the dots.
You've imbibed it without actually knowing.
Well, that's it. You know, so you might be a big Boy George fan, or I don't know, Madness, which became pop, or the Specials, or the Beat. Any of these bands, they all reference this material, and never really credited the origins. And so this is the work we're doing. By the time we get to Jungle, that was then co-opted into drum and bass, the disconnect starts to happen. But in the lead up to that, we had major hits, like even from the Asian community. People don't realize the Asians were the biggest buyers of black music in the UK, biggest non-white buyers, if you like. But it was being sold on cassettes and through shops. But what was it? Boom Shakalaka, massive hit coming out of Birmingham, Apache Indian, and then UK Apache. I always mix up the two, with Original Nutter in the 90s. Massive hit is Asian guy again. So, and some of the big producers of R&B in the UK are now Asian. So this contribution is what we're saying really needs to be promoted, celebrated, but most importantly, recognize where it's coming from. And each new genre created by this community that reinvigorates the charts, the industry, generates a massive income. And lastly, I'll just say that if we don't get it right in the UK, why should we expect people outside of the UK, where these records are selling millions of copies, to understand this contribution? You know? And it's about people's futures, it's about their pensions, it's about their royalties, it's about touring. It's connected, interconnected.
I will characterize the work that you're doing as walking barefoot on shredded glass. And that's not easy to do.
It often feels like that.
Okay, let's move, because this is a riveting conversation, and I hope that you're taking this in, because this is our history. And when I say our history, this is a nationwide concept. We are part of this history, but it is a greater history. So you're listening to Slipping Into Darkness on iLive Radio. I'm going to ask Michael to give me his next track, and we will move on. What are you coming with next, Michael?
I'm going left field now. I'm going into the Reggae Philharmonic Orchestra. Okay. The last track we played was Courtney Pine. So this is again Courtney Pine, but this time with the UK's first black string section that was put together by myself in the 90s. And it's a cover of Exodus by Bob Marley. And I should say that the RPO, which is the Reggae Philharmonic Orchestra, which also abbreviates to the Royal Philharmonic Orchestra, was a deliberate naming just to mess with them. But the string section became the most popular string section in the late 90s. And their work can be heard on very successful records, from Mark Morrison to Soul to Soul's first album, to Bjork, to E17, to Wet, Wet, Wet. Even Peter Andre's first hit single, you'll find way back in the day, will have the Reggae Philharmonic Orchestra on it. As a string section, we managed to get sponsored by Prince's Trust and did a lot of very high-flying balls from here to Hong Kong.
Just a second. I'm trying to find the Reggae Philharmonic track, and you've got 6.
Oh, it's called track 6, Exodus.
Okay, so it's track 6. Here, track 6 comes up as Scatterlights. So I think you might have to take over if you've got it.
It's just called track 6. 0 track 6.
We can't find it on the memory
Okay,
stick here.
well then you can play Redemption Song.
We might have to go to your laptop on this one, Michael, because Redemption Song and Reggae Philharmonic Orchestra are not in the 6 that you've given us on this. So I don't know if you want to take it from your side.
We can try.
Okay. Whilst we just do a little readjustment, let me just say you're listening to Mr. Michael Riley, who is currently the director of the Black Music Research Unit at the University of Westminster. And he's giving us, in a sense, just an outline, because if were he to go into depth, we would be here for weeks. I mean, he's been in the course for 20 years. He's been leading the course for 20 years. So we know that there's a lot of groundwork which he's covered. And I'm just so enthralled to be hearing this, because it's literally part of my years in the United Kingdom, the music that I listen to, exactly the same way that I started off listening to albums which I didn't know were jazz, but I came to learn were jazz, and some of those musicians were Caribbean musicians. So here we have somebody who's doing the research, who's trying to place this musical content in the history of this country, and effectively, it's here. Okay, let's go for it. We're working furiously here, trying to get it. let me just put in one track, and this is by Etienne Charles. So I'll play a track by Etienne Charles whilst we try to refine Michael's track. This track is called You Don't Love Me. Same little different recording. There we have Mr. Etienne Charles sing, and he's playing Dawn Pens. No, no, no. Interesting. I'm now going to put you back to Michael and bring it in, Michael. Reggae Philharmonic Orchestra. And Michael, you were saying that you have another hat as producer, and I take it that this will be one of your productions, effectively.
Yes. So this takes me back into writing, arranging, and producing.
Right.
And the orchestra was one of those vehicles that allowed me to just experiment. And one of the experiments was, could I pull together the likes of Courtney Pine, Kyle Brown, guitarist, the I3s, and could I get someone to pay for it?
Wow.
And with the orchestra, each album became a project. Right. In this case, I managed to get Island Records and Chris Blackwell in particular to set up, even working with the I3s. And anecdotally, I had to go to Jamaica, which was a huge challenge, but I waited for them for 7 days. They were 7 days late, but it was the best late ever because
you made good use of the time, I'm sure.
It was proper Jamaican late. But even when they turned up, it was not like 9 o'clock on the seventh day. It was the evening of. And they said, look, we're going to take you, to make up for being so late. Right. We're going to take you to a spa. Right, a traditional spa. I had no idea, because I'm thinking we're going to a building. There's going to be lights. There's going to be like warm water in a pool.
I'm sensing waterfall here.
Listen, I ended up next to a rock in the darkness in some bush in a stream. That was it was simultaneously slightly scary.
But they were looking after you.
Oh no, they were looking after me. But it was a surreal moment where they just got undressed, down to bra and knickers. Everyone just got down to their pants
and just walked in.
Queued. We had to queue. Whoa. There was local people there. And all you could hear in the distance was shh. And as you got closer, you realized this water was coming out of a pipe that was in a rock, and it was boiling hot.
Wow.
And you kind of stood there for as long as you could bear it. And then you walked off, and a lot of people just walked around in a circle and went back into the queue. But
that was definitely a one-off experience.
Very one-off. And, it was with my idols as well. So that was fantastic. And they then contributed to the album.
Wonderful.
Which, you can't ask for more.
Well, you mentioned Winifred Atwell, and, it sort of made me smile when, in a sense, the press seemed to think that we've only recently engaged in classical music. And the Reggae Philharmonic, this is going back, what, 3 decades?
The Reggae Philharmonic came together about 1990.
Right.
And I was working on a program called Club Mix. And I was the musical researcher.
Okay.
So I had to find bands. And the story goes that one week I couldn't find a band, and with the producers, you had to tell them in advance which bands are coming up and what are you looking for. And I said, I found a black orchestra. And they went, amazing. Where are they? And I said, well, they're on tour at the moment, so I'm tracking them down whilst I'm trying to find the musicians to put it together. And I had to go to all the music conservatoires in the UK. And they were explaining that there's probably lots of these individuals. So I'm thinking I can make a proper orchestra, about 85, 89 people.
Yes, of course.
But they're all referring to the same 10, 12 individuals. So once it became clear there were so few, that became the challenge. And the carrot was, I can put you on television. But they were not interested in playing reggae. Absolutely not. They'd studied classical music.
Of course.
The different mindset. What is interesting is how difficult it was for them to find work. And they explained that their work was almost seasonal in some cases, where the orchestras needed to have diversity. They'd get employment.
That
then
horrible word.
once they tick the box, they were back on the pile.
Thank you. No, thank you.
Exactly. And so they said, look, one black face in an orchestra stands out. And so all of us can't get work in the same orchestra at the same time.
Still the same case today.
You know, so the orchestra became a challenge to that. And when we toured, it was also interesting in terms of the audience response. It's a long story I won't go into, but we ended up with a tour, RPO, Royal Philharmonic and the Reggae Philharmonic in Germany. And we had separate venues in each case, and we were the support band, so we went on first. But Germany, they not only arrive early, they're proper early. And on occasions we're still in our sound check, and they turn up fully dressed in bow tie and mink coat and long dress, and they'd look at us on stage, they'd look at themselves, they'd look at us on stage again.
Go home and change.
They left.
Jeez.
This happened easily 50% of the gigs.
Wow.
There was a percentage of the audience that turned up really early, and all they read was Philharmonic. Reggae just didn't translate. And so that was interesting for us. But the flip side of that was we attracted a whole new following from not just, you know, German public, but from members of the Royal Philharmonic. I should point out this was the percussion and the brass section, which are notoriously the rebellious section.
Anarchic. Michael, we're going to have to continue this next week because we're coming up literally to the last minute, and this thing has flown so quickly. So I'm going to say you were listening to Slipping Into Darkness to my special guest, Mr. Michael Riley. I'm going to ask him to come back next week because he's only just started to scratch the surface of the tale that he has to tell about the important work that he is doing as director of the Black Music Research Unit at the University of Westminster. So you've got literally 45 seconds. Hit us with something that can take us out. And thank you for listening. We'll be back next Wednesday. Slipping Into Darkness.
It's 23 hours.
Radio, supporting independent artists from around the globe.
This is Chuck Ola, and you're listening to iLive Radio, changing the way you listen to radio.
Hey, this is Deja Bell, and you're listening to iLive Radio, changing the way you listen to radio.
This is Paul Randolph, and you're listening to iLive Radio, changing the way you listen to radio.
What's up, everybody? This is Minnie Manchester, and you're listening to iLive Radio, changing the way you listen to radio.
What's good? This is your girl, Drea Ivy, introducing my new show, Ivy Talks, the dopest podcast coming out of the beautiful city that is Miami, Florida.